History remembers William Wallace as a warrior of immense courage. But few know the real story of how he died, helpless, butchered, and ultimately human. Scotland remembers him as a national hero. A towering figure wrapped in legend, immortalized by Mel Gibson's roaring battle cries in Braveheart. The face of freedom, resistance, and defiance against tyranny. William Wallace, the guardian of a nation's soul. But there's a darker truth. A truth far removed from painted faces and cinematic glory. Because history isn't just made in triumph, it's forged in suffering. And Wallace's final chapter wasn't written on a battlefield. It was carved into flesh. It was screamed into the streets of London. It was etched into the minds of those who saw what an empire does when it wants to make an example out of a man. He was no longer the proud knight with a claymore raised to the heavens. He was bound, gagged, dragged through filth. Stripped of dignity. Stripped of control. What was once a symbol of rebellion became a bloody display of absolute dominance. This is not a tale of how Wallace lived, it is a reckoning of how he died. The slow, excruciating unraveling of a human body, and the deliberate annihilation of a symbol. His death wasn't simply an execution. It was theater. A medieval horror show crafted to shatter hope. Because for all his courage, William Wallace could not escape the one thing no warrior, no rebel, no legend ever can, mortality. And the way he met it was far more horrifying than you imagine. By the summer of 1305, the dream of an independent Scotland lay in ruins. The uprising that once roared across the Highlands had dwindled into embers. The nobles who had once cheered Wallace's defiance now whispered his name in fear. Betrayals multiplied. Rewards were offered. Spies closed in. And William Wallace, once the most wanted man in all of England, was no longer a warrior surrounded by comrades, but a fugitive hunted like a beast. The beginning of his end wasn't marked by the clash of steel, but by silence. Hiding in shadows. Moving at night. Living off scraps. His body, once hardened by battle, began to wither from exhaustion, hunger, and the weight of constant dread. His enemies were not just the English crown. They were time, fatigue, and worst of all, his own countrymen. One of them would seal his fate. On August 3, 1305, a Scottish knight named John de Menteith, nominally an ally, captured Wallace near Glasgow. No great battle. No last stand. Just a quiet ambush. Betrayed not by force, but by familiarity. Bound and dragged hundreds of miles south, Wallace arrived in London not as a prisoner of war, but as a traitor in the eyes of the English king. He would receive no trial in the modern sense. There would be no jury, no appeal, no mercy. The trial itself was a farce. He was paraded through the streets to Westminster Hall, jeered by a crowd trained to hate him. He stood in chains as charges were read: treason, murder, rebellion. But when asked to confess, he didn't beg. He didn't apologize. Instead, Wallace replied, "I could not be a traitor, for I was never the king's subject." A damning truth, and one that would seal his fate. Edward I of England, known as the Hammer of the Scots, saw rebellion not as a political issue, but a personal insult. And Wallace, the face of that insult, would be made into an example. Not simply killed. Destroyed. In this moment, the irony was suffocating. The man who had once stood tall at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, who led outnumbered forces to miraculous victory, now found himself shackled, malnourished, and mocked. He had struck fear into the heart of an empire, but in the end, he was made to crawl before it. This was the beginning of his final journey. And though his will may have remained unbroken, his body, his strength, was fading. He wasn't heading to a battlefield. He was being led to the gallows. But this would be no simple hanging. It would be a carefully constructed symphony of agony. The kind of death meant not to silence a man, but to erase him, slowly, publicly, piece by piece. And Wallace, the rebel, would soon learn what it meant to die in the full gaze of the crown he defied. They didn't just execute William Wallace. They unmade him. August 23, 1305. The city of London woke early. Word had spread. The rebel from the north, the so-called guardian of Scotland, was to die today. But not quickly. Not cleanly. At Smithfield Market, crowds gathered, not for justice, but for spectacle. They'd come to see a man broken in body, in spirit, if not by time, then by torture. But Wallace's collapse didn't begin when the ropes touched his skin. It had already started. By the time of his execution, Wallace was physically wrecked. He'd been dragged nearly 400 miles in chains. Likely malnourished. Likely dehydrated. Some accounts suggest he may have been injured during capture. Infections, untreated wounds, parasites, it's not hard to imagine the state of his body. A modern physician would say his immune system was shot, his joints inflamed, his muscles wasting. Whatever strength remained was willpower alone. And then came the real horrors. He was stripped naked and tied to a wooden hurdle, a rough plank or cart. Then, like an animal, he was dragged through the muddy streets by a horse. Face scraping the stone. Skin torn by gravel. The crowd jeered. Rotten food was hurled. And through it all, Wallace's body thudded against the earth, blood leaving a trail behind him. This was only the prelude. At Smithfield, he was hanged, but not to death. Just long enough to choke, convulse, feel the darkness crawl in. Then he was cut down, still alive. Gasping. Reeling. What followed is one of the most grotesque punishments in medieval history: hanging, drawing, and quartering. With surgical sadism, his abdomen was sliced open. His organs were pulled out, while he still breathed. His intestines. His stomach. Possibly even his heart. Historical records are inconsistent on timing, but all agree, he was conscious for much of it. They burned his entrails before his eyes. This wasn't punishment. It was ritual. A form of psychological warfare meant to burn Wallace's image from the minds of the Scots by desecrating the very thing that made him legend, his unbreakable body. Finally, the executioner beheaded him. But even in death, the destruction continued. His corpse was divided into 4 parts, quartered. Each quarter sent to a different part of Britain: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, Perth. His severed head was dipped in tar and placed on a spike atop London Bridge, a grim warning to anyone who might dream of defiance. To understand the full terror of this fate, modern analysts have compared the process to extreme forms of torture. Pain would have been beyond comprehension: burning, severing, and evisceration without anesthesia. Shock alone could have rendered him unconscious, but if he remained aware for even part of it, the agony would have been apocalyptic. And let's not forget the psychological dimension. Wallace, once a man who led thousands, who stood taller than kings in legend, now reduced to scraps. Not just dead, dismembered, displayed, devoured by time and crows. He was not granted dignity. He was made into a warning. The human body, so central to his myth, became his final prison. It betrayed him in its frailty. It screamed. It bled. It gave up piece by piece, until there was nothing left to give. And still, the crowd watched. Because in the medieval world, death wasn't just an ending, it was theater. As Wallace's body was being torn apart in London, something far colder was happening back home in Scotland: silence. No army surged to his rescue. No coordinated retaliation followed his death. The nobles who once stood with him, Robert the Bruce, John Comyn, and others, remained still, calculating, or complicit. The resistance Wallace ignited was splintered. His allies were now rivals. And his absence opened the door to new ambitions. Wallace had been the heartbeat of a rebellion, but rebellion alone does not sustain a nation. Scotland's lords, ever political, were already navigating the power vacuum. Some aligned with Edward I to save their lands. Others hedged their bets, waiting to see who would rise next. Even Robert the Bruce, Scotland's future king and romanticized heir to Wallace's cause, had a complicated relationship with him. At times ally, at times adversary, Bruce had distanced himself as Wallace's fortunes fell. When Wallace died, Bruce remained conspicuously uninvolved, silent not out of cowardice, but out of strategy. Because Wallace, by 1305, was no longer useful. He was a relic of a failed uprising. A firebrand in an era that now required political survival more than idealistic martyrdom. His presence threatened the fragile negotiations some Scottish lords were attempting with Edward. Better, perhaps, that he be removed. And so, as Wallace faced his torturers, many of his countrymen turned away, not with hatred, but with convenience. He had become a liability. Even Wallace's own family was likely powerless to intervene. We know little about their fate. His father had died years earlier. Any surviving relatives would have been either in hiding or impoverished, their names too dangerous to speak aloud. No kin stood by him in London. No last rites. No hand to hold. And the English court? It was already focused on its next move. Edward I continued drafting laws, strengthening his grip on Scotland. Wallace's death wasn't a turning point, it was a footnote in a broader campaign of conquest. To the English public, Wallace was simply a name. A villain from a distant land. His torture was not mourned, but celebrated. Chants and cheers rang out in London not because people understood who he was, but because they'd been told what he represented: chaos, rebellion, danger. And so, the machinery of empire kept grinding. Scotland did not collapse. It paused. Reorganized. Others stepped in. Others rewrote the story. Within days of Wallace's execution, the political order was recalibrated. English sheriffs returned to Scottish towns. Peace treaties were whispered. Loyalties shifted like sand. No mourning period. No state funeral. Just wind through the Highlands. Even Wallace's most passionate supporters had to move on. Farmers still had to plant crops. Clergy still gave sermons. Children still played in the dirt. The rebellion had always been a matter of survival, but survival demanded pragmatism. Wallace had lived as a symbol of resistance. But in death, he was inconvenient. Dangerous. Forgotten, not by the people, but by the very powers that once claimed to fight beside him. He had become a corpse, and a complication. The world did not stop for William Wallace. It simply adjusted. The last moments of William Wallace's life were no battlefield blaze or heroic charge. They were a grotesque, harrowing descent into the darkest depths of human cruelty, a spectacle designed to humiliate and terrorize. On that grim August day, the morning air was thick with anticipation and malice. Wallace, stripped naked and chained to the wooden hurdle, was dragged through the streets of London. The cold, rough cobblestones scraped his skin raw. The jeers of the crowd echoed in his ears like a relentless drumbeat of hatred. Dirt and blood mixed on his torn flesh, dripping with sweat and grime. When the hurdle reached Smithfield, the scene transformed into a medieval nightmare. He was hanged, but only briefly, just enough to choke and induce unbearable pain. The noose cut into his neck, constricting his windpipe, his body convulsing violently. Then he was cut down, alive, gasping, eyes wild with agony and perhaps defiance. Next came the drawing. His abdomen was sliced open in front of the crowd. The executioners pulled out his entrails, his guts burned in flames while he was still conscious. Each agonizing moment was a performance of power, showing all who witnessed that even the mightiest could be undone, piece by piece. The pain would have been unimaginable: searing heat, the sharp sting of cuts, the nauseating smell of burning flesh. His screams, if audible, were swallowed by the jeering masses and the crackle of fire. Finally, his head was severed from his body, a final brutal gesture of silence. But even then, the desecration did not end. His body was quartered, each part sent to a different town as a grim reminder of what awaited traitors. His head was mounted on a spike above London Bridge, tarred to preserve its horror, staring down at the city like a monstrous sentinel. No comfort. No compassion. No dignity. Only a slow, deliberate erasure. But amid the gore and humiliation, there was something profoundly human in those final moments, a tragic reminder that behind the legend was a man who suffered beyond measure. There was no glory in death. Only the cold weight of powerlessness. The mighty warrior who had once led thousands, who had dared to challenge a king, was reduced to a broken, bleeding figure at the mercy of his captors. His end was a merciless testament to the limits of human resilience and the terrifying reach of political cruelty. In those last screams, in that fractured body, lay the ultimate truth. No matter the legend, no matter the cause, death is the great equalizer. And sometimes, it is also the most horrifying. After the brutal spectacle of William Wallace's execution, one might expect a surge of outrage, a rallying cry echoing across Scotland and beyond. But instead, history's official story was quietly reshaped, crafted carefully by those in power to sanitize, obscure, and ultimately erase the horror of his death. The English crown, eager to maintain control and suppress rebellion, controlled the narrative with ruthless efficiency. Public accounts reduced Wallace's fate to mere treason and punishment, glossing over the agonizing details. Official records were sparse and sanitized, framed to remind the world that Wallace was a traitor, not a hero. Portraits and statues of Wallace were forbidden, or if they existed, they were removed or defaced. Chroniclers loyal to Edward I painted him as a villain, a barbarian threatening the peace. The gruesome details of his execution were buried deep in obscure texts or erased altogether. In Scotland, the crown's influence spread even after Wallace's death. Those who dared to speak openly of the rebels' suffering risked persecution. The political climate discouraged martyrdom. Instead, a more palatable image was cultivated, the noble patriot who died for his country, stripped of the raw, savage brutality of his actual death. Even centuries later, popular retellings would sanitize Wallace's end, romanticizing his courage but omitting the blood and fire of his execution. Films and literature focused on his battles and ideals, not the agony and mutilation he endured. This rewriting served a purpose beyond mere propaganda. It allowed nations and peoples to remember heroes in ways that inspire rather than horrify. The uncomfortable truth of a slow, brutal death disrupts the narrative of glory. It forces us to confront mortality, vulnerability, and the cruelty of power. Yet, this sanitization also risks forgetting the full humanity of Wallace, the man who suffered unimaginable pain, the victim of one of history's most grotesque executions. His mutilation was not just physical, it was an attack on memory itself. The crown sought to control not only his body but his legacy. And in that control, Wallace's true story slipped through the cracks, hidden beneath layers of myth, legend, and political convenience. William Wallace's life was forged in battle and rebellion, a symbol of a nation's desperate fight for freedom. Yet, it is in his death that we find a profound, unsettling truth that resonates beyond the medieval battlefield. His execution was not just the end of a man, but a stark mirror held up to the fragility of power itself. No matter how towering a figure may seem, no matter the armies commanded or the ideals championed, death renders all mortal and vulnerable. Wallace's gruesome death reminds us that power is fragile. It can be seized, wielded, and lost. His mutilation was a brutal statement by a ruler who feared the symbolism of a man who dared to defy him. But it is also a lesson about memory, how history chooses to remember and what it chooses to forget. The sanitized legends often shield us from the full horror of mortality, the pain and decay that even heroes must endure. In death, Wallace became more than a warrior, he became a symbol of resilience, of sacrifice, and of the human condition itself, caught between flesh and myth, suffering and remembrance. As the philosopher Michel de Montaigne wrote centuries later, to philosophize is to learn how to die. In facing Wallace's death, we confront not just a historical figure, but the universal truth that mortality is the great equalizer, humbling kings and rebels alike. His legacy lives not only in the battles won or lost, but in the raw, unvarnished reality of what it means to be human. In remembering William Wallace, we honor not just his courage, but the haunting reminder that beneath every legend lies a mortal body, and beneath every power, a fragile life that must one day surrender to time.